All right, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Invention of the Seventh Day Week with Dr. Ezra Zuckerman Sivan. This is our third session. We are back from our brief Purim break. If you were interested in here, if you're interested today and you want to catch up to the first two classes, they are up in Grisha's audio library. And we're just a quick bit of housekeeping. If you are watching and you want to speak, please only unmute yourself when you're going to speak. Otherwise, we get cross chatter, we get feedback, not so fun. But otherwise, you are encouraged to ask questions. The chats on both Zoom and Facebook are monitored, so do feel free to ask, and it will be heard. And if you're turning your video on or you're in Zoom, the raise your hand function is strongly encouraged. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Zuckerman Sivan. Good evening.
Thank you, Kayla. Okay, we are at 8:01. I'm wondering whether we should, there's a few people who are attending regularly. I don't see them, so I wonder if we should just get going. I can tap dance. It's one of the things it's odd about Zoom is that, people, you can just get on, so you don't know whether someone's on their way or whatever it is. But I will be happy to get going.
Well, your call. It is entirely your call. But it is we also have source sheet. There are also source sheets that will be shared in chat, both Zoom and Facebook. So
I forgot to mention one thing, which is it's going to be helpful for people in addition to, we're going to keep on going back and forth to Shemot Tet-Zayin, so Exodus 16. There are parts of that are considered on the source sheet, but the entire parak is in the previous source sheet, or in your Tanakh if you have one. So if people want to have that available also, that would be useful.
Can you repeat which parak people should keep at hand?
Tet-Zayin, 16.
All right.
All right. Okay. So there you go. Thank you, Kayla. Okay. Great. All right. So let me share my screen. Let me give you an update of where we are in this course and what we're going to do today. Mostly we'll take a look at the sources. So what we've done so far, you can see my screen where it says where we are so far. Good. Okay. So basically, among the things we did, and this is the focus of last lecture, was to really spotlight that chapter I just mentioned. So Shemot Tet-Zayin, or Exodus 16, that is the story of the Man and Shabbat. And what I've been suggesting is that this chapter, which we're kind of generally all familiar with, but maybe don't emphasize its importance and maybe even its sequencing as much as we might, that what it does is, number one, it describes the Shabbat/week. So that's one thing that I've been emphasizing, is that the Torah is not just presenting us with the Shabbat, it's presenting us with the institution of the 7-day week. And when the Torah uses the word Shabbat, except when it's saying the words Yom HaShabbat, but even then, when it's saying Zachar Yom HaShabbat HaKadosho, as Chazal teach us, you can't actually know what you can't actually just focus on the day of Shabbat without thinking about the entire cycle. And that is certainly true. It's especially true in a world that did not know of the 7-day week. So the only way to actually follow that cycle and observe it and therefore institutionalize it is to actually remember that day. So even when it's just talking about the day of Shabbat, it's talking about the whole week. Certainly when it's using the word Shabbat, it means both the Shabbat and the week. So it describes the Shabbat as a bewildering, disruptive invention. And that's in line with what we know about the 7-day week scientifically, number one. Number two, this was really the focus of the heart of last session, was that the Shabbat, I think it's useful to think about that first Shabbat that's described in Shemot Tet-Zayin as a paradigm for all subsequent Shabbatot to be remembered and kept, right? So that, hold on to it. That's the first Zachar, and then Shamor, to observe it in a way that that Israel is being instructed. And then, and this was the real heart of last lecture, was that it fuses together and fulfills the special or covenantal experience of both creation in its two senses, the two creation stories, both human beings as sort of little creators, and a sort of, in the second creation story, as sort of junior partners or child of God and relationship with God. So both creation and Exodus. And as part of it also, this is emphasized as well in the second version of the fourth commandment in Dvarim, in Deuteronomy, that it is also infused with an anti-hierarchical ideal. That's also part of that return to Eden aspect of it, which is sort of you're naked before God. All right, so what's left in our 3 sessions left? Today, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of like double down on the Shabbat as part of the Exodus story. Okay, and so this will be a really good kind of prep for upcoming holiday, among other things. That'll be true in the next couple of weeks as well, but certainly today. And so the important thing here is that, like, this is a sense in which you certainly could do today's lecture outside the context of my project about the invention of the 7-day week. That's probably, it's in some sense the least important here. But it's important, I think, that the Torah is not just telling us about, we invented the week and here's how it happened. We'll talk a lot more about that in the next couple of sessions. But it's also doing it in the context of a story, and is developing these ideas through lessons that it wants to teach us about that story, and therefore the Shabbat and the week are instruments in teaching us something. Okay. So what is that? And by the way, just where we're headed next week, what we'll do is the prompt for really getting for next week's lecture will be the shocking fact that in the Torah's account, the violation of Shabbat is a capital offense. That's to be the focus, and that's going to be something we don't usually frame in those terms and think about. It's sort of like an abstraction in Chazal. No one actually gets killed for it, but it turns out to actually be true. There's a story about it in Bamidbar, and it's going to be really important to reckon with that story. It's going to unlock a lot for us, and then we're going to get back to the question which we animated the entire series, which is what really is the Torah's answer to those scientific puzzles about the Shabbat? Why was the 7-day week only launched once? How is it possible for a disruption to routine to create new routines? And how, by the way, did the week win and take over the world? And is that all in there next week, in that last class? Maybe. But the Torah will have an answer that will be helpful with that, is the idea. And it'll build on these next lecture on this one. All right, today, I want to start off with something that I think I hinted at last week, but I didn't get into it. I think is a really good way to start in thinking about sort of the Shabbat and the Man as the climax of, in one sense, maybe an important sense, of the Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus. And so the idea, and so let's look at, I'm going to switch over to source one. We'll switch over to the source sheet, actually. All right, so this is in some sense the climactic moment, really, of this whole story. This is again back to Shemot Tet Zayin, and what we see here, this is this very important pasuk, the Vayishbetu Am Bayom HaShvi'i, and the people Sabbath on the 7th day. That's the end of the story. Vis-a-vis the Shabbat, there's a little bit of kind of addendum that has to do with the man in particular. What I want to focus on here is these set of verses that lead up to it. And in particular, what you see over here, which is these words, I'm going to focus on first these words here in blue. So this is, if you recall that Israel, basically, we failed to observe our first Shabbat, and God gets frustrated, and he actually takes it out on Moshe. How long will it take for you to refuse to obey my commandments, my teachings? And they just pay attention, right? Look, here's the Shabbat is here, and God has given you the Shabbat. Talks about himself in the third person. And that's why he, that is me, is giving you on the sixth day, twice as much bread, the Lechem Mishnah, all right? Bread for the last 2 days. And then it says, okay, so first there's this notion of God giving you something, okay? And so if you look at source 2, what you'll see is Chazal's famous elaboration on this. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. This notion that, and it shows up a couple of times in Chazal, and sometimes they're indirectly referring to this pasuk. I have a piece in Lair House about this, just a month or two ago. But what you see here is an imagery of God sort of as king, and Moshe coming to God. He's got a treasure house like a king does. Elsewhere in Chazal, that treasure house is, is a king's treasure house, and the king has this treasure, and he bestows it on the Jewish people, on Israel. Moshe is the messenger, and when you get is sort of this idea, and it's mysterious in the sense that they have to be told about it, that they're getting this message. This is there's a Gemara in Shabbat and in Beitza that both develop that idea. And it's a play on those words in that pasuk. So, and by the way, that's basically unique to the Shabbat over all mitzvot. That other than settlement of the land of Israel, the land of Israel is repeatedly described by the Torah as a gift in this sense. But Shabbat, all the commandments, is described as a gift. So it's another really important aspect of the Shabbat as a special gift that God is bestowing on Israel. And let me show you something else, which I think is really important to see. This is a kind of a long-standing mystery, is what's in purple here. So it's very strange, right? So it says, in the English here, observe that it is, it's me, God, who's giving you the Shabbat, and I'm putting in here the week, 2 or maybe for you. And that's why he's giving you 2 days worth of rhythm. And then you all, so shvu ish tachtav, you, every one of you sort of, should sit under it. And then there's an elaboration, you should not leave your place on the 7th day. And there are sort of halachot that are attributed, they're commandments that are about the Shabbat that are attributed to these psukim, in particular, the notion of tchum Shabbat, that you can't, there's only a certain amount of distance you can kind of travel on Shabbat outside of where you are. And Eruv sometimes is attributed to here also. But this is, if you didn't have these words, you would still have that. Nothing is really attributed to these words. And they're very strange words. Sit every man under it. Okay. And let me show you what I think this is a reference to. And you'll see there's various attempts to try to understand it. But if you think about for a second, where else in Tanakh we have the expression, a man should sit under it, a man will sit under it. Lashevet ish tachat. I would submit, if you think about it, you will immediately think of very famous verses that have that, that phrasing to it. Each man should sit under it, or will sit under it, right? Judith, you're nodding, right? What are you thinking of?
Fig tree.
Yeah, under a tree. What kind of tree?
A fig tree.
Fig tree, right? Vine and fig tree, yeah. So if you look at source 3, that's what you see, and source 3 and source 4, right? So source 3 is the most famous of this. Actually, if you watch the inauguration, like there was a poet who kind of gave a speech at Joe Biden's inauguration, and she referred to this. This is one of the most evocative, inspirational images of Achrit Hayamin, of Olam Haba, of utopia, essentially coming from the prophet Micha. It's got all kinds of stuff in it that we have in our liturgy. You got Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, Hashem Yerushalayim. You've got what else is in there? Lo Yisrael Goy Goy Cherev, Lo Yidum Milchama. So you've got images of Israel fulfilling its mission. Of bringing God and justice to the world, Tzedek and Mishpat to the whole world, and then everyone's dwelling security. And then there's this image here, V'yashvu ish tachat dafno tachat teinato, right? and it's not just theoretical, right? So if you look at source 4, you see almost exactly the same words. This is from the 5th chapter of the first book, of Malachim, of Kings. In this case, it's actual, right? So you've got, and those chapters describe the very, very, very height of the Davidic monarchy under Shlomo Melech, after he's built the temple. And again, there's unity. Judea and Israel, Judah and Israel are unified. They're dwelling in security. They're prosperous. Now, look, by the way, look over here. This is really interesting. There's also what you see over here is bread and meat, right? So they've got bounty. Sorry, bread and meat sound familiar, right, from our story in Shemot Tet Zayin, Exodus 16. Man is, we didn't emphasize what there's the Slav and the man. And then you have here, so UW Israel, okay? And in fact, there's a whole bunch of other references. These are the most direct references. In general, this expression is the biblical paradigm for living the good life: security, unity, peace, prosperity, all bestowed by a benevolent king. And so that's the message, actually, the Torah is giving us about the Shabbat, that the Shabbat is the way for, and the king in the question in this case is God. God is providing, in this case, Shabbat is an abstraction. There's no actual tree, right? Shabbat, as we talked about it's sort of metaphysical in a sense. It's not tangible, but it is. If you just pay attention, it's saying you will live the good life from the Shabbat, and I think that speaks to us still to this day. I mean, you could say, so back to my switch over to the. So what I want to say is like that is just a really, really powerful idea, and sort of fulfillment of what the Shabbat is all about. We'll see actually even next session about how that actually relates even more to the Exodus story, that particular, as a sort of a sort of an answer to Paro. There's a bunch of things going on here that's like, the divine king is a benevolent king, whereas the human king is a tyrant. But basically, we've got a gift bestowed by a benevolent king. It's this biblical paradigm for the good life. I would say, it's the basis, I think, the scriptural basis for Chazal's idea of Shabbat as the taste of the world to come. So there's a connection to these kind of utopic, eschatological, visions of Micha and others. And I would actually also think, if you think about Heschel's notion of a palace in time, right? This sense of Shabbat that is in these verses is really, really important, because otherwise we might think, well, this notion that we have that every Shabbat is like connected somehow and sort of transcends time. How could that have been true for the first Shabbat? Because they didn't have all the things that we associate with the first Shabbat. We know evidence that they did. There was no kugel, there was no parsha, there was no all the things we associate with Shabbat. But this description of Shabbat as the good life in this way, that resonates, right? So it connects us with that first Shabbat and creates that sense of transcendence that with all the Shabbatot are sort of connected to that experience. Okay. But here's the thing. If we go back to the beginning of, so the next source, we go back to the beginning of the chapter. Okay, so now I'm going, as I said, the objective here is to see how this fits in the larger story of the Exodus. If you go back to that, to the beginning of the chapter, we have a big problem. Okay, and the problem is that, here we have this image of, Shabbat as the good life, as the benevolent king. And if we look at that source, what number of source is that? 1 second here. Okay. Source 5. This is going to be maybe the most important source for us to look at for today. So this is the very beginning of this chapter. And right away, if we look at it, we should have a lot of questions, like a lot of questions. The most important thing here is the contrast. so they come out to the wilderness of Sin, between their last station in Sinai. 15th day, telling us, basically place and date in that first pasuk, the first verse. And then they're complaining, okay? And they complain, their relationship here is with Moshe and Aaron, right? And they speak about God only in the third person. And they speak about God very negatively, right? This is not people who are looking to God as the benevolent king, right? They think of God, how would you summarize the way they're describing God here? How do they think of God?
More like a master?
A master? Yeah, a good master, like a benevolent master?
I don't know if I'd put it that way.
Yeah, like, can think about tyrants who are in the world today, who you might think are more apt, right? Basically, they're scared of him. They're scared that God is going to somehow, and there's some plan to actually bring him out into the wilderness and starve him to death, right? So this is really, really awful image of God, and they're not even they're complaining to Moshe about it, Moshe and Aaron, and it's very strange. Right? Look at this. Let me show you a couple. So there's a whole bunch of questions that we should have on this. Let me walk you through them. But this notion here of Yad Hashem, so the hand of God. Okay, so there, who would would it been who was going to give us? We wish we could have had our deaths at the hand of God in the land of Egypt. Now, what are they referring to? Well, here's the time where this shows up in Egypt. That's in the 5th plague. So it seems like they're referring back to the 5th plague. Here it is. Yad Hashem Hoya B'mikdacha. This is where God actually, so it's interesting, ironically, this is the first time that God makes a distinction between Israel and Egypt. So the previous plague, in plague 4, there's a distinction between Goshen and the rest of Egypt. So it's based on place. In this case, apparently, the livestock of Israel is treated differently than the livestock of Egypt, presumably when they're even side by side, right? It's not simply based on location. And they're remembering this, it seems, and remembering it in a very negative way. That is strange. Not only that, but let's look even more nearer term when they've talked about the hand of God and where hands have come up. Okay, that is here, source 7. This is very, very familiar to us. We say this, every day. This is the text, and we excerpt from it, every single prayer service. Wow, do we make the Song of the Sea very important in our liturgy? And here it is. And if you look through it, I want to show you a couple of things. So one is, if you look through and see that I'm using this color, whatever that's called. Anyone want to name that color? I don't know what that is. Same color I'm using as I used the previous for anytime there's a hand mentioned. So here I was doing it, right? And here I'm doing it again. If you look through source 7, what you'll see is 7 times, right? So it's a keyword and a significant keyword. Torah does that. You should pay attention. It varies it a little bit. Sometimes it doesn't use the word yad or hand. It uses the word yamin, as in right hand, so powerful hand, right? And one other time it uses the word zroa, arm, right? As we know from Zerah Netuyah, like it's basically sort of a forceful hand doing something, intervening in the world. And so this is actually like right. This is where they're mentioning the hand of God, and this is a hand that actually is like on their side. It's continually on. It was on their side back in the 5th plague, and it's certainly on their side here, right? They saw the great hand that God did in Egypt, and that made them believe in God. Right? And they believed in God. They believed in Moshe. This is just a couple weeks before, right? And that they were at the height of emunah, faith, and it was emphasizing the hand of God. Very strange, right? 7 times. I want to show you, let me actually make sure that I want to, just to flesh it out, let me just make sure I've got all the questions that, so you have them in mind. Almost all of them I'm going to address today, of what I think questions are we should have about this strange tantrum. Okay. So here are the questions. All right. One question we should have is, wait, can you see this? No, you don't see it. 1 second here. Let me show you these questions. The main question I've given you, but I want to make sure, just to make sure you have all of them, because there's really a lot of questions we could have and should have about this panic that they have. Okay. The first one is, they have no cause to complain. The text does not say that they are out of food. Does not say that at all. And in prior complaints, they've already begun complaining. The first time they complain is after Moshe and Aaron first go to Paro and say, let my people go. And Paro responds by making their work harder. Then they complain. That's a good reason to complain. Then they've got the Egyptian army bearing, the chariots bearing down on them. Another really good reason to complain. Then they're out of water. Also a good reason to complain. Here, they have no reason to complain. They are not out of food. Or at least the text doesn't tell us they are. The text could have told us this. It goes out of its way to tell us this elsewhere. So that's strange. The second thing is, if you look across all those stories, it looks like there's actually progression towards realizing that God is the address for their complaints. The last time that they complained, Moshe publicly prayed, by Yitzhak el Hashem, he prayed. Why are they going to Moshe and Aaron and not to God? That's also strange. There's something else here that's going on if you look in the verses, which is there's a really 3 different ways they go. The verses go out of the way to tell you everybody complained. Everybody's in this. It uses the word kahal, congregation, or edah. It uses the word kol. Everybody's complaining. Why everybody? Strange. Also goes as a way to tell us that it's in the wilderness this is happening, even though it just told us that it's in the wilderness of sin. Doesn't need to tell us this. That's extraneous. It also tells us the date, 15th of the 2nd month. Torah does not tell you a lot of dates. It does not even tell you when Sinai happened, for goodness sakes. Everybody knows, right? We all know that. Why is it telling us about this date? Very strange. And now, this is really going to be really important. The formulation of their complaint is famously enigmatic. And there's 4 different aspects of it that I want to emphasize. Number 1, this is famous, though it's a little bit misleading because we tend to fuse this complaint with the one that's in Parshat Ba'alotcha in Bamidbar. That's in chapter 11. Let's put that aside. That's a different set of complaints, and we make a mistake if we fuse them together to think of the same set of complaints. That's the one that talks about how the seeded, the cucumbers and the watermelon that they remember, or something like that, in Egypt, and fish. Put that aside. Here, they seem to be having memories of meat and bread. We've already talked about meat and bread, right? B'shiftenu al sir habasar, they say. Also strange phrasing, right? As we sat by the flesh pot, that's usually translated. This is a case where I think the King James translation somehow has had a big impact because it's come into the English language in a way that could be problematic. But the flesh pots of Egypt, like somehow we think that means positive things. I think it's merged together with the memories in Ba'alotcha. But let's not assume that's what it means. And then it's B'ochlenu lechem lasova, as we ate to our satisfaction. So those, and what's weird is that those are two rosy memories. It seems like in the first blush. Number 1. Number 2, they're 2 distinct memories, because it doesn't say ooh. There's no vav between them, not linking them. It's actually just it's 2 different. Like it's like there's a beat there. B'shiftenu al sir basar b'ochlenu lechem lasova, in 2 different occasions. I mentioned already number C. What is the big deal? The God's hand is very strange, given that we're supposed to, like God's hand is supposed to be on our side. And the last one is, this is, I think, really important. There's an internal contradiction here. They're saying, if it weren't for you, Moshe and Aaron, who like snookered us and brought us out into the wilderness, two things would have been true. On the one hand, we would have enjoyed the good life. But on the other hand, we would have been killed by God. Guess what? Those two things do not go together. Right? Very strange to say, hey, we're complaining about those two completely contradictory things. So we need to understand what's going on that led them to make these complaints. That's what I want to develop for you. Okay, and I think it's going to be very instructive to understand what the Torah's message is about the Shabbat and the week. Okay, so let's go back to our sources for a second. And I wanted to mention one other thing before we get there. This will be part of our approach. If you notice in source 7, I'm mentioning that they're channeling Joseph, channeling Yosef. And that's not at all immediately obvious. But I want to suggest that there is a Yosef element to the Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. Does anyone, what would you connect to Yosef here in the Song of the Sea? What is Joseph like about this song? Well, what is Joseph most famous for? What is his greatness?
Joseph is strength.
Vision. All right, good. Joseph is strength. Okay. Vision. Yeah. Is there a vision in this? There certainly is, right, Ozzy? I see Susan.
What kind of vision are you talking about?
Well, I think he has visions, right? He's a prophet.
Right.
We know that from Bamidbar, right? We'd somehow he's a dreamer. He's a dreamer and he's interpreter of dreams. And this is a prophecy, right? Think about it. When else do we have Israel, really, and even Moshe, prophesizing and saying what the future is going to hold? This is it, right here. It's in the Song of the Sea. They're telling the future. Now, not only are they telling the future, but they're also talking about how things are going to be good for them, right? God is on their side in this, just like Yosef seems to think God is on his side, right? You might even go so far as to say, like, Yosef basically thinks that, I'll try to say this in the least problematic way, but, that he can almost, he has such good insight into what God is going to do that it's almost like he controls God. Right? That's the danger anyway, of thinking what God is going to do. And he's acting in God's stead. Now, that's not exactly what's going on here, but if you look through the themes of what's going on, is God is a Ish Milchama, a man of war. He's the king, right? By the way, who's famous for thinking he can control kings? Yosef. Right? Paro. We'll get into that. And I want to suggest it's not far-fetched. Oh, and so now he's describing, look at here's the prophecy is all about, here's the English side, right? There's going to be all these different battles they're gonna face. Plishtim, Moab, Edom, we're going to face all those different enemies, and God is going to lead us to battle, just like he just did. They're projecting the future. And they're predicting all of that. And there's an element of time here, right? They're basically describing what's going to happen in the time. Now, it probably sounds like a big stretch to think they have Yosef on their minds, right? Or they're channeling Yosef. But we should remember this, why they might have Yosef on their minds, right? The Torah goes out of its way to tell us just a few verses before that when they left Egypt, they took Joseph's bones. They're carrying him through the sea, right? And that's a big deal. Like he's their patriarch they're carrying. And you would think they would have, inspirational memories of Joseph when he, what he did for them in saving the Jewish people, saving Israel and bringing everyone together and all of that. And so a Joseph kind of maybe inspiration. Okay, now let me start to build that a little bit as a teaser. Let me start to build an answer. Here's what happens next. I'm skipping over a little piece, maybe I'll get to it at the end, which is Miriam Neviah, Moshe and Aaron's sister, who leads the women out in song in response to the Shira. I think that's actually going to be important, but we'll come back to that. But here's what happens after that. Okay, this is very important. They go, so Moshe takes them 3 days out into the Midbar Shore. They find no water. Amazingly, they don't complain at that point. So they're still filled up with faith, apparently. Then they finally found some water, but it's actually too bitter to drink. And then miraculously, the water is turned sweet. Okay, that's great. God helps out in that case. And then there's this very, very, very enigmatic verse, right? God then, seemingly, it's actually a little bit unclear who's doing it. We'll go with that. Made for them a fixed rule, a chok. Okay, some kind of statute that's sometimes translated as, but as we'll see, I think it's in this case probably more likely to think it's some kind of fixed allocation. And there's no Rebbe Hanan Summit, I think. I think it's Rebbe Midan has suggested that it means sort of like a fixed allocation of water. They're allocating the water, something like that. That's one idea. But some kind of ordinance, right? Some kind of law is being handed down. It's a chok umishpat also. And it seems like there's some kind of test that's being, but very enigmatic. Okay. And then we have this. If you listen to God, God's voice, God, your voice, and you do everything that is yashar beinav, that's a biblical theme, everything that's on the straight and narrow, and you listen to all his commandments, you follow all of his statutes, again, ordinances, what's going to happen? All of the disease, pestilence, I don't know how they're translating that I put on Egypt, I will not seem on you. I am God, your healer. So here's a key question. If you're Israel and you hear this, are you happy to hear this or not? On the one hand, yes, God is your healer. On the other hand, what do you think of these terms? In a word, what would you say?
It is an indirect threat.
I mean, it sounds threatening. Direct or indirect, I'm not sure.
Right.
But it sounds scary, right? Like super scary. By the way, so it's basically this very tough, what do we call this? Midat Adin, right? It sounds like there's just like this very tough regime of, what do we call law and order nowadays, right? Very tough law and order. That's what it looks like. And by the way, what are these laws that he's talking about? They haven't been given yet, right? They have no laws, although a few they got in Egypt. Like Pesach, is he talking about, or the calendar? So it's got to be a lot more than that. Like you got to do what's right in God's eyes, but we don't even know what that is. So now you've got, we just said that this is the, Ish Milchama, right? The man of war, who's going to be can destroy the greatest armies in the world, right? The Egyptian army, and then after he destroys Egypt, Moab and Edom, pushed him, it's going to be, child's play. And now we're up against him. And we've got to follow all these laws that he's never even told us about. And he's just shown us he's willing to made us go 3 days without water, play around with us with the, this sounds terrifying, right? If you look to sources 10 and 10a and b, you can see that this is basically Moshe in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, elaborating on these ideas. They show up again, right? So this is the beginning of Parshat Ekev. Same exact language, basically, and the same exact consequence. You got to listen to God, otherwise you're going to get Egyptian sickness, plagues. Okay, same thing you see over here. This is later on. That was Perek, Zion, the 7th chapter is 28. Same thing. You got to listen to God, otherwise, zap. Right. By the way, here's the word makah. Right. So it's referring back to those makot. You're going to get makot just like the Egyptians got if you don't listen to God. Same exact language. This is an elaboration on this, on what they're saying over here. It sounds really tough. Now, here's the thing. Moshe softens the blow. Famously. Look down over here. Next or 2 chapters later, what does he say? He's following the same kind of language. You got to listen to God. You got to listen to those chukim, right? But I'm giving you a Sefer Torah, right? I'm giving you this giving you the law. You have a law. And not only that, but famously, it's accessible. It's not out of reach. But so at this point, and they've lived with it for 40 years, right? So they know it is accessible, or at least it's got to seem more accessible. But now think again of the contrast. When you're back over here, without that message that it's accessible, you got to be scared out of your mind. Okay. So I think that's key to changing their mindset. God is on their side, and all of a sudden, oh my God, why do we assume God is on our side? Why should we assume it? Now look some more. Okay. More reason for them to get nervous. This is the next station after Marah. They come to Elim. In Elim, there are 12 springs and 70 date palms. And they're there for, I forget now, a couple of weeks. Okay? If you're there and you're sitting around and you're Israel, and you just had this kind of like terrifying experience at Marah, after having this kind of, believing in God, you thought you were on his side, and you get here, what are you going to be talking about with 12 springs and 70 date palms? I'm sort of giving it away over here. That's the problem with doing these short sheets, right? Like, what is 12 and 70? 12 and 70, 12 and 70. People are talking about it. You're there for a couple of weeks. You got nothing else to do, right? 12 and 70. So that's what's coming on the next sources. You're going to be reviewing your history. How did we get here? Right? Shivim Nefesh, we're going to say in a few weeks in the Haggadah, right? 70 souls went down to Egypt. 12 tribes. There they are. So they're going to be thinking back. So if they weren't thinking about Yosef before, they're going to be talking a lot about Yosef now. And they're going to be converging on their story because they're going to be sharing, they finally have time to breathe. They were in Egyptian bondage all those years. So they're going to be converging on a national narrative that involves, and they've got his bones here. They're going to be talking about Yosef and what Yosef did. If they do that, what are they going to remember? Well, if you look at their complaint about that God is going to kill them, and it's going to be, if you think about the first part of the complaint, V'ochlenu lechem lasova, when did they eat bread to their satisfaction? And those language, lechem lasova. Here it is. And God is going to kill them with ra'av. That contrast in ra'av and sova, of starvation and satisfaction, right? Or abundance. Yeah, I like that, Ozzy. Thank you for that comment. That's a good comment, right? Well, it first shows up here. This is Yosef's interpretation of Paro's dream. And he describes it as the sevens that you dreamed about. Well, those are sevens of plenty and of starvation. And I'm going to fix it. And I'm going to fix it through my plan, which we all know about. Okay. So they're thinking of that. Not only they're thinking of that, but that was, a story that Yosef was at. What they all remember, or at least they've got passed down memories of, is the next stage of where this shows up. And this is, I think, a really, really, really important text, which we do not read carefully enough in general. And what I'm going to say here is not original to me, but it's not something I think it's really, really important in thinking about the story of what happens, of the message, the story of Israel's experience in Egypt, and the message we take away from it. So again, if you want to find somewhere else in Tanakh where people are complaining that they're going to die of starvation, that's this. And it's not Israel. It's not us. It's Egyptians. And the reason they're complaining they're going to die of starvation is because they're living under Yosef's regime, under his vision, his plan. And he turned the Egyptian people into slaves to the crown. That's what this plan had in effect, if not in intent. One of the most important things, I think, in this chapter is the contrast, the really, really stark contrast between Israel's experience and the Egyptian experience. And you can see it in this transition here. So Joseph finally gets all the brothers and the father down to Egypt. Yosef, and he provides for them. Lechem lefi hataf. Right, so a little tricky to translate, but something like bread for maybe the mouth of every babe, something like that. If you're doing it very literally, every person, every child had food. And look at the next verse, the lechem ein b'chol haaretz. And the Torah is going out of its way to draw the contrast. I would suggest it's not saying ein lechem, it's lechem ein. That's a strange construction, but it helps to draw that sharp contrast of all of Israel had bread. The Egyptians, there's no bread in the land because Yosef controls all the bread. And then what happens over the next few years, right, is that they get successively pauperized through this plan. So one thing, just notice the orange is here. So one thing is, if you look at the word that's green, lechem is the key word here. It's all about lechem, 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 lechem. You can see there are 7 of those. The oranges, this has already started foreshadowing, these are words that show up in, or in slight variation in the man story. Where I'm going to head is that the man and the Shabbat are actually, in a way, repudiations of Yosef. Or at least fixing, their tikkuns for Yosef, put it that way, in Chazal's terms. The man and Shabbat are a way of teaching us what Yosef may have had, maybe Yosef had no choice. In order to save the family and sort of save himself, he had to be Paro's instrument for basically aggrandizing and the crown and being kind of this classic court Jew. But in so doing, he turned the Egyptian people into slaves, essentially, whereas Israel prospered. Look at the contrast also at the end of where is it? Here it is again. So here's the last verse of it. It tells you actually it's the very last thing they say is, you have kept us alive. Joseph is playing God. He is God in this story. And that's the role he's playing. And they credit him with keeping them alive. And then he basically gives, here's the chok, by the way, right? There's a chok, he treats the treats Bnei Israel as if they are like these exalted priests in Egypt. They're special, and you see that. In the end, you've got this is the contrast. Israel's doing great. They are, entrenched, and they're prospering, etc. Okay. So all that orange there is all stuff that we're going to see later. We see some of that already. Here's what we just saw, right, in Marah. God gave a chok umishpat, and here's Yosef doing it. Joseph is acting like God, and he does it again and again through these chapters. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you where was it? Okay, and then what we have is, you want to keep on telling the story. Well, so then you see basically here's famously the transition, new king in town, but the Torah starts off with an elaboration on that end of that chapter, where what you see is basically there's again the 12 and 70, and you've got that verse, which is just saying what happened was they kept on growing, though it seems to have some kind of critique in there. It's almost like too much. The Torah is saying that, not the Egyptians, that they were sort of like, sherets. Israel somehow was like getting too big, getting too, I want to translate that. There's a problem.
Swarming.
Excellent. Thank you. Good. All right. So, and it's not very hard to tell a story about why the Egyptian people would have gone along with this divide and conquer strategy. They enslaved us, we'll enslave you. Good, measure for measure. Tikkun, right? Okay. Now, we just covered why it is that they might be thinking of B'ochlenu lechem lasova, that when we remembering Egypt, when we ate well and to our satisfaction, why that actually might be not a happy memory, or it was once a happy memory, now it is a scary memory, or feelings of guilt, effectively. Do we have reasons to feel guilty? Yes, we do. If we're Israel in that moment, we're thinking about, and what I'm having in mind is, okay, so God just told us that he's gonna judge us based on us being yashar. Were we yashar? You know, did we live according to tzedek u'mishpat? It's not clear. It's ambiguous at that point, and it looked like we were being punished for it. Now look at the next thing. So it's b'shiftenu al sira basar. Where we sat down by flesh pots. So I want to suggest that has a very straightforward interpretation, and it's here. They're just using a different word for pot. Turns out saf means pot or basin. This is a description of sitting and eating the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, during the night of the 10th plague, the very last night they were there. Oh, I forgot one last thing. Well, I'll mention it now, it's not important. But I forgot another mnemonic, not just 12 and 70. There's another mnemonic that they were experiencing, and that is the full moon. So why does the Torah go out of its way to tell us the date? Doesn't care about dates, but it's the second month, 15th day of the second month. Well, when was the first day? The only date that really matters to them is what happened the prior month. And if these people are, people who just experienced the Exodus, they just had the experience of being told that there's a new moon, you've got to take out the lamb on the 10th day, you got to wait around with this lamb for 4 days and then have this kind of mass ceremony. This was a major, major, major experience in their lives. As they watch the moon, that's what they're going to be thinking about. They are filled with memories of the night they left Egypt, which they may have been thinking about the positive sides on, right? But given this chain of memories, might they also think about their neighbors whose clothing and valuables they have with them, right? And who they had this meal and protected themselves with the blood that was stored in these pots. How else did they store it, right? They collected it in basins and pots. The next source basically shows you that's the word seer usually means. It's used in the for karbanot in sacrifice. This is just one example throughout Tanakh that way. So I want to suggest to you that their memories that they have of their experience in Egypt, that probably up to that frame of mind, they were thinking, oh my God, we're awesome, right? We, Yosef was our great leader. We want to be like Yosef. We're amazing. We can be like Yosef now. That was the height of our history. The second kind of peak was that night of the Exodus. And so they're leaving Egypt, and then, maybe they came down again when the Egyptian army was charging, but wow, they must have been at this incredible height when God was on their side and victorious. But ever since then, they've been dragged down memory lane with the big question mark of why are we deserving? And if they go down memory lane in that, thinking about it hard and thinking about it, really reviewing it, we have very good reasons not only to have survivor's guilt, but even to have a sense of perpetrator's guilt mixed in. In general, a very, very big question about why we deserve to be treated any differently from the Egyptians. That's the big question. And why is it that we didn't get, why in that first moment when we were distinguished from the Egyptians, why? It's a major, major theological question that they have, and I think appropriately, that we should always have. Why are we special? Okay. Here's God's answer. And this is, I think, key to thinking about it. This is the narrative of leading into. So God's answer is the response to their panic. That's source 18. How are we doing on time? Okay. I got the answer. I thought I had a little more time in this, but I'll just outline the rest. This is fine. Here's the answer. God says, I'm going to be mamtir lechem min hashamayim. It's an amazing thing. So Yosef had his way of providing bread. I have my way of providing bread. I'm going to be. Yeah. So I think, Ozzy, you're right. I think they were not inclined to be thinking about how we mistreated the Egyptians. But I think that's the point of these few weeks, is to take them down memory lane in a certain kind of way, is to review it. If it weren't for that, I don't think we would, but I think it helps to do it. Okay. So there's two really important aspects to this response. Okay. One is God is giving a free gift. We sort of said with Shabbat, and it's true here. He's going to be providing. So the point is, God is not just an Ish Milchama. He's not just a destroyer, which is all their experience they had of God so far, is a God of the destroyer. God is also provider. And that Mamtir, right, goes back to the very first verses of the second creation story. That's B'terem Himtir. God is providing from Mishamayim, right? The wherewithal for us to eat. That's where it comes from God. And the second is this notion of God is providing a nisayon, a test, okay? And that's tough, yes. But, and this is, you can see this in, I'll skip over that source, but you can see this in this very nice chazal there from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Let me just go to the original on this that he's elaborating, which is from, this is the important point here, is now Moshe and Devarim again. So here Moshe is explaining how this works. And he's saying, this is about the commandments in general, but he's playing off the man, and the man, I would say man and Shabbat, but the man regime of the man. He's saying it's for life. This is a big theme of his this is where you get life from. It's for you to get to know, to understand, right? And this sense of making you starve and actually tormenting you, right? And this regime, this tough regime, where you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, your next day's bread was coming from, was there as a training program. So God's answer to the question of, are you deserving? He's basically punting on the question and saying, I'm not interested in the past, right? Other than maybe Brit Avot, but that's not the emphasis here. I'm interested in the future, and I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to give you a free gift. And also I'm coming up with a way of both testing, and testing here is training. Any kind of test also implies that you're looking forward and that you've got a shot, right? But it's a training regimen, right? And so you have this again and again and again, this notion of, and you experience deep in your hearts, right? That just as a, stern father trains their child, right? Yisurim, right? So like tough training, that's what God was doing here. Okay. If you look back, I know we've got just 2 minutes left. That's the main message that I wanted to get to is, let me just emphasize one really important thing. So what you'll see in the rest is also a little more play on, I think there's a bunch of Yosef references in here also. One of them you'll see is to do with the notion of mouth. So there's a mouth theme, the most that almost like Yosef as a mother bird is feeding Egypt and people through his mouth. And you'll see here it's God's mouth. That's more important. That's really where the source of food comes from, not man, not humans, but God. But the really most important thing I want to just leave you with is we should think about what. So two contrasts, but one is thematic, which has to do with sevens, right? So Yosef was about basically 5s over 7s. I can send you some more stuff on this, but basically was overcoming 7s, and 7s were a godly cycle that God revealed to Yosef about cycles of providing food and not providing food, and he was going to overcome it through the technological mechanism. That technological mechanism was storage. And storage sounds very mundane, but it's really, really key, right? We know about this from COVID, how important storage is, right? And it's a way of not only sustaining life, but it's also a way of controlling time, transcending time. And so if you think about the regime of the Shabbat and the Man, it's a return to a divine beat. That's 7s based. That's based on like Moshe is saying here, starving and providing food that God determines, and basically saying, and shows you that who controls storage? Well, you try to store it doesn't work during the week, store it the next day. God basically is in control of that, right? That's the sense in which it's a tikkun, right? It's basically, for fear you might think, as Moshe says here, that you might think that you are the source of your bread. God, the benevolent king, is the source of your bread, is the key message. going back to the, how we started off this morning. Let me show you one last thing just to add to this. You can see some things, which is, I just want to show you. So the last few sources, you can see, number one, if you go to Baalotcha again, where this story comes up, you'll see that the hand of God now means something new. It means now the sustaining hand. God's sustaining hand is limitless, is what God says over here to Moshe, who maybe doubts it. Okay, so the Yad Hashem now is transformed through this process to mean a sustaining hand, not just a destroying hand. They learn that. Second, if you jump ahead here, this one, it's really cool. So I think the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, is amazing for a whole bunch of reasons. One of which is it's filled with false prophecy. The word false prophecy makes us nervous, but wrong prophecy, right? Errors of commission and errors of omission. Errors of omission, it's amazing. Here they are seeing the future and they don't see Sinai. No mention of Sinai. No mention of Shabbat, which is coming in just in a couple of weeks, right? It's amazing what's omitted, and then what's committed. It's an image in particular. They talk about winning these wars, and they talk about God winning the wars for them. At the end of the very same parsha, the end of chapter 17, the war of Israel against Amalek, you have a war in which God is basically hidden, and they have to fight the war. And you could say, yeah, God, Moses raised his hands are up. Oh, so then there's a hand theme again, 7 hands. You look through all those purple hands again. And it's a reversal. It's basically saying, not only do you not know who we're going to fight. Oh, by the way, they don't never even fight Edom or Moab, right? There's one we get right, which is about Mogu Koshiktan. The rest is not. So there's a lesson there about not being too much like Yosef in that respect as well. Getting too big for our britches that we think we know a God, who God is, and maybe even, are in control of God. Here's the Miriam point. I think this is pretty cool, which is that we think of Miriam as just echoing, but notice there's no Ish Milchama here. There's no martial imagery. It's just short and concise. It echoes the first words, and the hand shows up, right, as a celebratory hand. I'm not sure, it's on a drum. It's making, it's violent, I guess, but in a different kind of way, right? It's a much more humble, I think, response than in the Shira, right? And then the main response. All right, so I'll just leave you with that. The basic idea here, right, is number one. Here, I'll put back quickly on this since we're still here. Here we are. Okay, takeaways for today. Oops, here we are. Okay, so God answer is number one, I'm not just a destroyer, I'm a provider. Number two, my laws are not so inscrutable you can grasp them. Number three, I may be like, and by the way, I think that's a key part of those first psukim that I mentioned, right? So Ru'u ki Hashem natan lachem Shabbat, pay attention, right? You can actually get this. It seems like you can't get it, but you can get it, right? I think is a precedent for what Moshe is emphasizing. I may seem like a tough parent, maybe even worse than a parent, but it's all meant for you for your benefit. Moshe elaborates on that. And then this regime is meant to be a check on your Yosef-like hubris that can get you in trouble. And I mentioned all those points already. All right, so next what we'll do is, why is Shabbat a capital offense? That's a hard question. We think about it. And then we'll get to, if you want to look at it in advance, very short, right? There's, that's 31. Oh yeah, these are the texts that tell you about, again, multiple times that it's capital offense, kare too, but also capital, and then the story of the wood gatherer. All right.
All right,
Happy to stay on. Probably going to get off. Yeah.
That does look like quite a big and weighty topic for next week.
Thank you,
and if anyone wants to catch up either on the first 2 classes or this class. They are up on the audio library or on Drisha Live. And source sheets will be posted to the website soon after with the, I guess, extensive material. And if anyone has questions, is there an email address they can reach you at?
You can always email me, ewzucker@mit.edu.
All right. All right. That's good to know. And thank you everyone for joining after our post-Purim break. It's good to see everyone. And
Look forward to seeing you next week.
all right. And if you're interested in things that come not in 7, but in 5, there is a Drisha class coming up this Sunday that I'd like to highlight. Our annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture is coming up on the topic of Manishtana, the Mishnah's 5th question, with Dr. Hanan Gafni. Again, this will take place this Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And if this is something you're interested in, you can check out our class page, drisha.org/classrooms, to sign up, along with our other spring semester classes. And with that, have a good night, everyone.